I'm Rekai Rusinga. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Davis, and I'll be chairing the session. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. We have a very exciting panel with 3 presentations and 2 discussants who will provide comments afterward. Then we will conclude with time for questions and discussion from the audience. So with that, let's begin. The first presentation is going to be by Markus, Liliia, and Mehmet. And they will be presenting on a paper that is titled "When Observers Become Targets, Russian Subversive Contestation with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe." So our presenters, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rekai, for the kind introduction. Okay, perfect. So this is a project called When Observers Become Targets, and it is a co-authored work with Markus Pollak, who is also in the audience, who is a PhD candidate in Central European University, Liliia Sablina, who is a postdoc in Vienna School of International Studies, and myself, and I'm a postdoc in University of Salzburg. And this is a first draft, and we kind of use this conference as an opportunity to start with this idea. And we want to make this project kind of larger in scale. So your comments on that front or on any front is more than welcome. So the picture you see is the OSCE electoral observation mission had commenting on Turkish elections in 2018. And, he talks about issues with electoral integrity publicly. So you can see a Turkish voter in front of him. So this is in Turkey, in an authoritarian regime. So indeed, electoral observation missions also exist in authoritarian regimes, non-democratic regimes. And these observations also do not fully hold back from addressing electoral integrity issues. And there is some evidence on how this affects electoral competitiveness in authoritarian regimes. But what we do not have much evidence on is how do authoritarian regimes frame such international electoral observation missions. So once they decide to accept these observations, how do they talk about it? Do they completely attack it? Do they frame it in a strategic way? We believe this question is important because first, we want to understand if this is another way where autocrats attack liberal international order. Secondly, we know that authoritarian regimes prefers legitimation over repression. So is this part of their legitimation strategy so that they repress dissidents less? Third, we know that electoral observation missions actually aim to address the transparency issues to the public. But if there's a rebuttal from the autocratic side, this gets sort of mediated. So we want to understand this mediation mechanism. And so when we look at the literature on electoral observations and authoritarian regimes and sort of intersection of these two, one distinction we could make is exogenous versus endogenous contestation of electoral observation missions. So the exogenous way is basically rejecting the liberal electoral observation missions or the independent observation missions, and you doing parallel monitoring or mimicry in a way. So, creating their own international observation missions together with allies. So if I'm Turkey, maybe I invite Russian and Venezuelan observers to create confusion and to distort the objective evaluations of the sort of non-allies observations. And actually, we have some evidence that the independent electoral observation missions sort of findings and reach gets significantly distorted when there are parallel monitoring observations from the shadow observers, so the allies in a way. And then there is another way we can think of contestation that will be endogenous, basically staying within the electoral observation, liberal electoral observation institutions. So in this case, OSCE, for example, but subversing the norms there. So basically by saying that we believe in OSCE as such, but it is missing this and this things. And typically they say they are not objective. So by staying within the liberal international institutions, but sort of subverting and manipulating them discursively. But this sort of contestation can also be thought of as norm contestation. And this norm contestation, so we are now diving inside the endogenous one, could be think of in two categories, which is subversive versus reformative. So subversive would be completely destabilizing these norms, attacking them and deeming them illegitimate in a way. So this would be just saying that OSCE is not legitimate, or these are completely scams. So these are not representing any objective evidence. Whereas on the other hand, reformative approach could be more nuanced. So this would be saying that, yeah, we believe in these institutions, but these institutions need significant reform. And our argument is that autocrats contest liberal norms within by using both reformative and subversive norm contestation. And this is exactly where the electoral observation missions also fit. So how they engage with electoral observation missions is an extension of how they engage with liberal norms at the higher level. So we focus on the case of Russia at the moment, though we think of expanding to 5 or maybe 12, all the OSCE cases. So Russia is a typical case of endogenous norm contestation, right? Vis-a-vis OSCE. So they are part of OSCE and they make statements that suggest they see themselves as an integral part of OSCE, but they do not necessarily like the way it works. And our data is actually collected by another colleague, George Komae, who basically collected speeches from Russian Parliament, government of Russia, and presidential administration, and foreign ministry between 2003 and 2023. So these are all press releases and speeches from these actors. And we start from this corpus and identify instances where OSCE electoral observation missions are mentioned. And our empirical strategy is threefold. First, we, based on keywords, filter our data. So we simply look at the instances where the word OSCE or different extensions of it, so we use a regex approach, are mentioned. And this, of course, leads to a lot of false positives in a way, because they can talk about these institutions without necessarily talking about electoral observation missions. But that's where our structural topic model comes into picture. So then, using structural topic modeling, which is basically a occurrence matrix with covariate-based information, we identify the instances where OSCE electoral observation missions are mentioned. And we identify 156 documents where this is the case between 2003 and 2023. And in this case, we are certain that there are no false positives, but on false negative side, we want to improve. And then finally, we manually code these instances to identify the themes. So this is sort of the topic we are talking about. And basically, we got the documents that scores high in this topic. And then we also apply additional keywords. So this is how we reached the 156 documents. So this is the sort of variation of this topic over time. First of all, in 8% of all the documents related to OSCE, electoral observation missions are mentioned. So this means it is somewhat relevant to general discussion of OSCE. And you see that there isn't significant variation starting from a certain point, but indeed OSCE electoral observation missions became more relevant compared to the very beginning of Putin regime, which is sort of ironic because that's when the regime was slightly more democratic in a way. But what we see is the sort of some fluctuations after 2010, but rather stable between 5% to 10%. And then how these missions are discussed, we identify 5 themes. So one is what we call validation through OSCE monitoring. Basically, Russian government selectively amplifies neutral or positive findings in a way that serves their purposes. And so I provide here examples, and all of them are from Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So basically reporting the OEDIHR's report on US elections and some irregularities there, the Russian foreign ministry says, we call the United States to pay closer attention to findings of the institution. So this is clearly, when United States is a democratic country, they emphasize that, whereas when actually there is a talk about Azerbaijan, for example, they say that, so there's a very similar statement where they say OSCE always talks about negative aspects of the Azerbaijani elections. So this is sort of selective framing. Second one is call for transparency and reform. In a way, they frame Russia as a constructive reformer of OSCE. So they say that we make these reform suggestions, but OSCE or the IHR do not follow these suggestions. And this is where the problem with this institution is. Third one, and this is, I think, a very interesting one, although it's less prominent than the previous one. So the transparency one is the most prominent one. Delegitimation of OSCE, basically framing ODA, IHR, and OSCE as politicized institutions that serves Western interest and has double standards. So this keeps recurring, but here's one example, basically where they say the electoral observation mission should stop being politically motivated. Final one is voluntary sovereignty, in a way that it frames Russia as a sovereign member of OSCE and a cooperative one. So we participate in OSCE because we want to contribute to global peace and because we want it so, not because international norms dictate so. So we are not subject to these norms, but rather we are participants of these norms. Actually, when you look here, the delegitimation narrative, so we said transparency, but delegitimation narrative is the most prominent one, and this doesn't vary across time. So what you see here is actually all of these topics are not far from their baseline probability from the beginning to the end. So there isn't much variation on how they discuss about these things. There is some, especially with sovereignty and validation, so they sort of take over each other, but it's rather stable. However, we still think there is some variation in the way Russia engages with OSCE, if we also consider the pre-Putin era. So
sorry to interrupt, Mehmet, you have about 5 minutes left.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. So one way is, so in the very early era, Russian government engages with OSCE as through validation, as a validation tool. Basically, they accept OSCE and they see it as a good thing, and they see it as a thing that stabilizes elections. So they sort of accept its superiority, if you will. Then 2003 and 2007, so this is when Putin regime already starts to consolidate. We see reformative contestation. So what we see is Russia realizes itself as an OSCE member, but does not necessarily like the way OSCE does business. And this started with Putin and Lavrov as a foreign minister. Between 2007 and 2018, we see direct contestation with liberal order. So they do not necessarily start not recognizing OSCE's legitimacy in a way. And, some missions get canceled. There's already parallel observers. and the shadow observers, sort of liberal mimicry era. But we think from 2018 onwards, gets more interesting. So there is complete rejection of OSCE, and in one of the elections, they cite reasons of pandemic to not invite them, but they invite the shadow ones. So by 2018, it is a sort of opponent of OSCE, Russia, if you will. So with that, contributions of our study is we suggest that authoritarian regimes embed contestation within institutions rather than solely defecting from and mimicking them. So we suggest that they accept electoral observation missions and other forms of liberal institutions, but they do not only do mimicry, but they rather engage with this reformative contestation within. So they suggest that these are good things, but we do not like how they are done. Second one, this contestation is done in a multi-layered way. So sometimes it's about sovereignty, sometimes it's about Western interests, sometimes it's about lack of reforms. So we sort of show this variety of this contestation. So what we want to do next is we want to increase the number of countries. So our ambition was sort of to have a corpus of all autocratic states in a meaningful way, and we filtered based on electoral observation missions. Then we uncovered the varieties, but within our time frame, this wasn't possible. So we are not sure if we want to focus on like 5 cases and have more data, or we want to focus on all autocratic members of OSCE, which makes up to 12 of them actually. Then for classification, we are thinking to use LLMs in the next step, maybe topic GPT, so we still stay inductive and identify the frames. And then we want to, of course, extend it to inferential statistics as well. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mehmet, for the very interesting presentation. Quite insightful. Like I said, we'll have discussions once we have all the 3 presentations before moving over to the Q&E session open for all. So with that, we'll hear from the next presenter, Andreia, and the presentation is titled Cleaning the Vote, the Victory of Electoral Anti-Corruption Social Movements in Brazil. Andreia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Rekai. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, chairs. Thank you, discussants. And I would like to especially thank Professor Gabriela. She's been great, and she has initiated me on electoral integrity, which has been quite an adventure. And so my paper is called Cleaning the Vote, the Victory of Electoral Social Movements in Brazil. And so a quick overview. So I'm talking about the role of civil society in Brazil through the anti-vote buying law and the clean slate law, which is pretty different from the other 2 papers, right? I think when we talk about electoral integrity, we constantly talk about civil society as electoral observers, right? No, but this is people, like these are masses, right? Getting together to push reforms, okay? And so the methodology I use is case studies and process tracing, and I'm currently doing a quantitative analysis on a mechanism that I want to talk to you about called the mobilizing corruption perception. And third, I will argue that the Brazilian anti-corruption electoral laws are cases of domestic electoral organizations, right? As Grumping conceptualized, Max Grumping, 2017. And I argue that their missing mechanism is mobilizing corruption perception. And so I intend to do 3 deliveries in this paper and in this presentation. So first, the analysis of these laws. I want to tell you about the social movement behind these laws. And then I would like to, again, argue that they are cases of domestic electoral monitoring organizations missed by Grumping in 2017. And my third delivery is that these domestic electoral monitoring organizations, they are created, they mobilize, they come about because of mobilizing corruption perception. And so a little bit on, literature review on electoral integrity. Everyone is a specialist here in this conference, so I'm not going to get into too detail. But I think that civil society has to be seen beyond, facilitating international interventions or reforms, beyond electoral observers. They have to go beyond just being considered electoral watchdogs. Civil society, in these examples from Brazil, they were actually the protagonists of these really huge changes in elections in Brazil. And so these questions have to be, we have to give more time toward these questions, like when does civil society step in effectively, under what conditions, how do they thrive, and through which mechanisms. And so a little bit about the literature review on corruption perception. And so the big part of this literature finds that it's demobilizing. This is pretty forward, right? And there's this information effect that is always in place for this demobilization effect. A smaller part of the literature finds that corruption perception mobilizes, and I stand in the middle, okay? I find evidence that corruption perception can mobilize and demobilize depending on information. And this is what's innovative about my work, because information is only dealt with when we talk about demobilizing corruption perception. So depending on the nature and the type of information, corruption perception can cause these two effects. So this is a little bit about these information effects. So first, we have this information effect caused by corruption scandals, media, right? Every time we turn on the TV, we read the newspapers, there are loads of corruption scandals, and that causes demobilization through cynicism, apathy, and so on. So we have this high corruption perception, people that are demobilized, and on top of that comes a social movement that all of a sudden spreads these accountability solutions, that they are simple, they're cheap, and people can actually do something about corruption. And that information causes them to mobilize through engagement, action. And in these cases, we're going to talk about, they sign petitions, right? So we have these two types of information causing these different effects, right? One mobilizes and the other demobilizes, right? And so this is my first case, the anti-vote buying law of 1999. We have the Catholic Church just gathering people and, talking to the masses. And, here in Brazil, there's a parish, there are churches everywhere in Brazil. And the Catholic Church is not a political actor, right? So they're neutral. They can talk to anyone. They come in and out of Congress with no problem. And so start this campaign, and they're so successful. They push this law in only 42 days. It's the fastest law ever passed in Brazilian history. It was a really big popular pressure on Congress. And the second law, the Clean Slate Law, we have a longer process. It lasted 8 months. There was more struggle, more obstacles, but the movement against electoral corruption was founded in 2002. They grew, they became stronger, they formalized, and they are able to, again, push the second law. And so I want to take a little bit of time here on this slide. So how do I analyze these laws? I organize into internal and external conditions. So the first and foremost external conditions about popular initiatives of law. So in 1988, the Brazilian Citizen Constitution placed this direct participatory mechanism that people can gather, they can sign a petition, and Congress is forced to review and to appreciate this proposition, this reform, right? And that's what they did. And so for the internal conditions, we have very experienced leaders on corruption. And then I told you we have these two information effects. I also told you that there's this credible leadership of the Catholic Church, which is neutral, and then it becomes the movement against electoral corruption. And they push these two very big changes in electoral integrity in Brazil. And so this is a very old picture of the constituents saying that without the people, nothing new is created. And so what does this all have to do with electoral integrity, right? So this is what I want to convince you, that both Brazilian laws are cases of domestic electoral monitoring organizations, conceptualized by Grumping in 2017 in two different articles in a chapter book. And Grumping says that the drivers of mobilization are two, right? One is grievances and the other is political opportunities, which equivalates to the internal and external conditions that I saw in the Brazilian anti-corruption electoral laws. And so
just a quick time check. You have about 5 minutes remaining.
Thank you so much, Rekai. Thank you so much. And so domestic monitoring electoral organizations are non-state, non-partisan, non-media. They're collective actors. They're politically neutral. They witness, they report on electoral malpractice. They evaluate legal frameworks. They offer appropriate recommendations. They advocate for improvements. So today, the movement against electoral corruption from Brazil, they are advocating in favor of gender quotas, and they are struggling to bar changes to these two laws I'm talking about. So they are very active to this day. And so grievances, they are inside the internal conditions that I told you about. And what I argue is that the missing mechanism to these grievances is the mobilizing corruption perception, as I told you. So really quick, it's when we have the dissemination of an accountability solution to corruption, to electoral malpractices, to electoral irregularities, and that convinces people to actually mobilize and do something about it, right? As for political opportunities, we have the popular initiatives of law. And so a couple of similarities and differences. So the anti-vote buying and the clean slate laws are domestic electoral monitoring organizations, but they differ a little bit in their organization, right? So they're formalized civil society organizations. They don't intend to be institutionalized. They don't intend to be a state arm or a government sort of, branch in that sense. So they want to keep in the civil society side. Their objectives, they want to expose and prevent electoral malpractices. They want to promote reform, but they don't do systematic electoral observations, right? They don't intend to. They don't intend to train people to monitor elections in that sense. And about their sustainability. So the movement against electoral corruption is more problem-oriented in that sense. And domestic electoral monitoring organizations operate more continuously because every election they're there. The Brazilian movement, they take these problems And of course, they take several years to solve them, and it's really hard to get, to collect these signatures and pressure Congress. But they are more problem-oriented in that sense. So maybe the Brazilian movement can learn from domestic electoral monitoring organizations if they want to, I don't know, have more visibility, or they want to be more stabilized, right? And they also are different in the repertoire of action. So the Brazilian movement uses more contentious politics, and such as signing petitions and campaigning and protesting. And I think domestic electoral monitoring organizations, they use activities toward observations in that sense. So my final remarks. These Brazilian laws are domestic electoral monitoring organizations. The missing mechanism to them is mobilizing corruption perception. And I suggest that the concept of domestic electoral monitoring organization should be, I don't know, perhaps reviewed, complexified, to embrace these Brazilian cases, or maybe a typology should be created to put these cases underneath them, right? And so lastly, my future research agenda, I'm looking for postdoc opportunities to continue these studies in Latin American countries, right? So I already have statistical evidence that the mobilizing power of corruption perception in Brazil is real. So I'm using the causal mediation R package from EMI to multiply the information effects with the corruption perception variables. And what I find in Brazil is that the more informed Brazilian citizens feel, the more they perceive corruption. And how do I measure corruption perception? I measure them, framing them as a national issue. So what is the most serious problem of Brazil? Corruption. Or I frame that as a government failure. Do you think your government is fighting corruption? Yes or no? And I find that these two variables, they end up tending, being a tendency for more protesting. But, so the thing is, when I multiply the information with government failure, I have a demobilization effect. So I can see that depending on the type and the nature of information, we can have different outcomes of mobilization or demobilization. And so I want to expand this quantitative research to Latin American countries, and I want to also qualitatively do case studies of more domestic electoral organizations. And thank you so much. That's it. My email is there if anyone want to talk to me, and I'm eager for the comments. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Andreia, for the presentation. Among other things, prompting us to think about expanding the definition of domestic election observer groups. Quite interesting. And good luck with the search for postdoc opportunities. With that, we'll move on to the last presentation, where we are going to hear from Clément, Markus, and I think it's you two are going to be presenting,
Yeah.
right? Okay. And the presentation is titled, "It's a Small World. For 20 years, it has often been the same people, national policing and differentiated transnationalization in the field of OSCE election observation." So let's hear from our presenters.
Thank you for this introduction, and thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to present our research project on election observers and selection processes. I have to say that this is one of our first presentations, so we look forward to receive your feedback and questions, of course. So you write the paper. The paper is entitled "It's a Small World. For 20 years, it's often been the same people," which is an extract from an interview with election observers. And so our ambition is to analyze the national policies and the differentiation inside transnationalization of the field of the electoral observation, taking the case of the USCE. I don't know, Markus, if you can turn to the second. Perfect, thank you very much. So there are several ways to explain the power relations within election observation. I would say that the political perspective often accuses this milieu of being dominated by the West. And in international relations, the dominant explanation is to look at the power of states by taking into account, for instance, their financial weight in organizations that carry out election observation. And in contrast, other sociological explanations emphasize the weak integrative and socializing nature of electoral observation. And so observers arrive on these missions with their own social characteristics, and these characteristics determine their power inside the field. For instance, the election experts' legitimacy would be greater than those with less experience. And I think that our research is original in that in the way that it examines the individual's cases, the individual's careers of observers involved in the OSCE election observation activities, as well as the time they spend in this field. Perfect. So our theoretical perspective is international political sociology, which aims to understand social fields based on individuals and their social proprieties, as well as their interaction in order to understand the construction of transnational spaces. And in this paper, we focus on electoral observations as a transnational field, populated by individuals of different nationalities, different professions, and who circulate within various organizations. And this field is weakly autonomous, not very socializing, as I said, and comprises agents with different degrees of professionalization in electoral expertise. So this field is particularly weak because it is partly constricted by national policies for selecting observers, particularly long-term teams, since the core team's members are recruited directly by the organization in the case of the USCE. And this paper draws on two main empirical sources. The first is a longitudinal database drawing from the OSCE reports, containing 270 observers and their participation in 476 missions between 2005 and 2023. And the second is a qualitative survey sent to the focal points about the selection processes, the recruitment criteria, the working condition of observers, and the foreign policy objectives. And so to analyze this data, we carried out a clustering analysis. And this first graph, as you can see on the slide, represents every single individual's career, including the date of the first mission, the various positions held during the career, the number of missions, the breaks, and if any, the exit from the field. And this career database is ordered using a hierarchical cluster analysis. If you can turn to the next slide, perfect. This method groups individuals according to the similarity of their career. So for instance, these four clusters show a group of observers. The first one shows observers who only complete one mission, so a very small experience inside the field. The second one in green groups individuals, members of the core team with long careers, and the bottom two groups comprise long-term observers with various lengths of service. And so these clustering methods, if you can turn to the last slide I have to show you. This clustering methods enables us to compare the results of observer selection policies and working conditions offered. The different national graph trees or tree graphs reveal patterns. The first, called volunteer recruitment, indicate that observers from this country intervene only punctually. On the contrary, the second graphs show that only some individual observers from this second country regularly return to missions. And finally, the third graph shows a case of a country with regular and almost professional observers at the top of the graph. So now I let Markus the time to present our conclusion.
Yes, thank you, Clément. So starting from here, you can see that these three models, they're important not simply because it's interesting to see how different the countries are, but also because they're in part a reflection of different national strategies and power structures within that field of election observation. So, of course, you maximize in some way the leverage of your observers if you have a more highly professionalized and more consistent field presence, while one-time observers have a less of a status in the field, of course. So let's look at what we find concerning that. So when we looked into we already discussed kind of, let's say, the empirical facts, but what do we make out of it? Why is this relevant for the research field? So we argue that basically these recruitment strategies and the corresponding structure of the national fields are reflecting both foreign policy strategies, international power structures, but they're also leading to asymmetry within the field, asymmetry when it comes to professionalization. So there's 4 ideal types that we theorized based on the data that we have. So that maybe will clarify why this is important. And all of them are in the OSCE missions working together on the same thing, right? So they are always in teams of 2, making decisions about the attribution of electoral legitimacy. And partly the 2 people in the same team, they are having radically different backgrounds, right? So what type of practitioners do we encounter in the field? That's what we try to look at. So if you start from the bottom, you see that the first type that we identify is the volunteer civil society actor, who has normally a rather low to medium level of professionalization and usually uses election observation as a part-time career path. There's usually also high fluctuation. Since they are being recruited directly by national focal points, they are not very transnationalized and are very reliant on national recruitment bodies and on national focal points. So there's a lot of control from side of ministries of foreign affairs in the respective countries. Even stronger on that regard is maybe the second type, the national delegate, which you can find as the second from the bottom, which is basically that category of observer that is mostly relying on civil servants who go on observation. So they're not recruited kind of from outside the institutions, but are coming from government itself, which is a usual practice in many different countries. I think Slovenia, for example, does it a lot. But also, let's say, the accusation often is that Russia, for example, does that. As we heard in the previous presentation on Russia as well, there is some let's say, the accusation of that being a deliberate policy of sending so-called national delegates to the OSCE missions to have direct leverage within these missions. Then there is the intermittent intervention practitioners. There's a bit of less of a fluctuation because they are usually relying on these kind of professions and are available for intermittent field presence. But they are still relying.
about 5 minutes left.
Okay, great. So they are still relying on national focal points as the other two types on the bottom, because they're being recruited mostly directly by national focal points. So they are, and then there is what we find the transnational election expert, and that's the part where the on the next slide I will show you on the differentiated transnationalization. So where we find that there is one category or one ideal type of observer that escapes to some degree the national gatekeeping, and is able to, that is particularly present in core teams at headquarters. So their national focal points do not select those observers, and there is a high degree of continuity among those transnational election experts. And they are really, let's say, the leadership level of the field that reproduces its structures. So as Clément already touched upon, where we work with this idea of transnationalization weak field. Why do we work with that? Because we argue that it's important to understand where the power lies in election observation, who is able to influence how these missions are looking like, and who is able to basically determine electoral truth in these missions, right? So to have interpretive authority. So in the case of OSCE, it's interesting to look at, is it the nation state still having some power over those who are deciding on if what they're finding on the ground, or is it there a certain element of transnationalization, as it is a transnational mission, right? So, and we find especially on the higher levels, so on the core team, headquarters, etc., this higher level of transnationalization, and on the lower levels, more dependency on national focal points. So there is this differentiated transnationalization that we find. And the weak field that is linked to it, which is basically a specialization without autonomizations, basically meaning that there is, it's not as institutionalized as some fields that have very clear requirements to enter the field and a very clear centralized gatekeeper in some way. Because in the case of the OSCE, you have many, many different gatekeepers that are deciding if you're able to enter the field or not, and many different qualities that, depending on the gatekeeper, you need to bring in or can transfer from other fields in order to make a career as an election observer. So there is an increased presence of what has been in international political sociology often called double agents or plural professionals. And also linking a bit to the first presentation today, because it is a so-called weak field, or as we would argue, it's best described as a weak field, it offers also some space for contestation, since the implementation of the practices is always relying on these many different gatekeepers and socialization processes. So to wrap up, we think we speak to two different puzzles. One of them is clearly theoretical, and linked to the international political sociology literature on transnational fields, if there is even such a thing as transnational fields, or if it's in the end still, for example, nation states having the power. How does it look in practice that an IO is having such a mission, and can it be really autonomous? We'll try to explore the weak field and look at how the election observation practices unfold on the ground. And then there is the empirical puzzle, which probably is most relevant for this conference as well, is how does a mission come into being in the first place? What kind of power relations are there in the election observation field? And why is it also maybe more vulnerable to contestation than other fields? Which is linked to the simple question of who are the observers, right? And we try to answer that by looking at their career paths and at the recruitment procedures, at gatekeeping. And our argument, as I laid out and as Clément already laid out, is that it's maybe best understood as a weak field characterized by differentiated transnationalization. So the higher up you go, the more transnationalized, and with asymmetric professionalization, since in some countries, much more professionalization happening than in others. And that is a reflection also of national strategies and power structures. So this is kind of wrapping up our argument. Very happy to receive feedback since we're still at an early stage of this project, but we have some significant findings and would like to develop it further.